the best person to compare yourself to is you yesterday and not someone else today. The first thing is you should figure out who to compare yourself to. And I think the best person to compare yourself to is you yesterday and not someone else today. And the reason for that is you don't know anything about these people that you're comparing yourself to usually. Like, one of the things I've noticed is that it doesn't take much discussion with someone, no matter how successful they are. You scratch below the surface and you find that their life consists of trouble and suffering in proportions that you could hardly imagine. Almost everyone is dealing with some serious problem, personal problem, or problem in their family. And relative status, I mean, I suppose it's better to be rich and miserable than poor and miserable, but you know, the misery is universal. And so what you're comparing yourself to, if you're envious, it's an illusion, and it's not a helpful illusion. It's not a fair race to be racing against someone else, but it's a fair race to be racing against yourself. You could be slightly better than you are. And that will actually, the thing about that's so cool, and I think the psychological literature really indicates this, is that slow incremental improvement from your initial baseline can take you places that you couldn't possibly imagine, and envy is only it's an impediment to that. And then it's an illusory impediment too, because those other people, they don't have it as good as you think they do. What happens, you see, Cain and Abel are actually the first two human beings. They're the first two human beings, real human beings, because Adam and Eve are created by God, and so in some sense, well, they're not like us. But Cain and Abel are born, and they're two sons, and they enter a state of mortal enmity, you know. And the reason for that is that Abel makes sacrifices to God, and Cain makes sacrifices to God, and Abel's sacrifices produce success, and Cain's produce failure. Now, you know, the sacrifices are very concrete. They're making burnt offerings, and that seems very anachronistic, old-fashioned, and incomprehensible to modern people. But the idea was that you could offer something of value. You could let go of something of value in the present, and you could offer that up. The smoke would rise to God so he could detect the quality of your offering, and if the quality of what you were sacrificing in the present was high enough, then the future would work out for you. And this is an unbelievably brilliant insight, because human beings are the only creatures that have really figured out consciously that you can let go of something that you need and want now and forego gratification, and you will actually improve your future. So it's a huge deal. Now, it's a huge deal that this was discovered. You know, it's the discovery of the future. And so it's a massively important story. Yes, and it's the discovery that you can actually act in the present so that you can bargain with the future. And it actually works. So it's a real miracle. So, and then what happens is that Cain's offerings aren't accepted and Abel's are. And this makes Cain very, very angry. And no wonder, because, you know, if you're working hard and it isn't working, you know, people aren't happy with you and you're not making progress through your life, then you get bitter. And that's what happens to Cain. And so then he goes and has a conversation with God. And he says, like, what's up with this world you created? I'm working myself to death here, you know, and nothing's working for me. And my brother Abel, well, everything's coming easy to him. Everyone loves him. What's happening? And God says something like this. He says, sin has made its entry into your dwelling place, into your home. And sin means to miss the target. It's a sin to miss the target. So you can do that by not aiming or not having the skill. Anyways, God tells Cain, and it's a terrible thing to tell him. He says, sin is waiting at your doorstep, and you've invited it in to your life, evil, and you've entered into a creative union with it. And it's that creative union with this evil that you've invited in that's compromising your sacrifices, and that's the cause of all your suffering. And Cain is devastated by this because he's already not happy that, you know, Abel is doing extraordinarily well and all his work is going for naught. And now he goes and complains to God about the structure of the world, and God says, you look to yourself. Your sacrifices are not what they should be, and you've made terrible mistakes that you're not taking responsibility for. And Cain, he can't tolerate that. The story says his countenance falls. He becomes absolutely enraged at the structure of existence. It's not only that he's suffering, but that he now realizes that the suffering is self-induced. And he can't tolerate that. And he's so angry at being and at God that he decides he'll kill Abel. And it's a terrible thing because Abel is also his ideal. So he kills his own ideal, right? And then he tells God that his suffering is more than he can bear. And he's running away from his terrible crime to hell. There's no other way of putting it, and I'm not speaking metaphysically. One of Cain's descendants is Tubal-Cain, and Tubal-Cain is the first person who makes, in tradition, he's the first person who makes weapons of war. So and Cain's sons are even more dangerous than Cain. And so there's this idea in this old story that it's this envious rage coupled with this inability to make appropriate sacrifices that produces misery, and then that misery can desire to manifest itself in the world in the exaggeration of suffering and malevolence, and that leads to social collapse. It appears as though Cain's sacrifices are second rate. You can never tell, because there's some, look, sometimes people work really hard and things don't work out for them. There's an arbitrariness about life, and that is left ambivalent in the story, although there is this strong undercurrent suggesting that Cain is playing fast and loose with the divine. Well, let's say he's playing fast and loose with the future. Well, that's not going to work. Everyone knows it's like, if you want the future to work out properly, the sacrifices that you make now have to be real. And people understand that. I ask my students, most of whom are children of first-generation immigrants at the University of Toronto, and so pretty dedicated to their task. I say, well, what sacrifices did your parents make so that you could go to university? And I mean, they moved countries. They left everyone behind. I mean, this idea of sacrifice, which is concretized in the story of Cain and Abel, is something that every modern person understands. But it's useful to understand it in an articulated way. It's so strange that you can bargain with the future and that it works. It says, well, I'll forego this gratification now. I'll take the harder route now, and the future will open itself up positively. And that actually works. Every undergraduate who procrastinates is guilty about it. They're torturing themselves. Atheistic or not, there's no escape from this. They wake up the night before, or maybe it's the night before their final, and they put everything off. They're sweating, they feel weak. Humility is the key to that. It's like, look, if you have a child and you love that child and you want the child to develop, you set them a task that exceeds their current domain of competence. But you set them a task that they have a reasonable probability of succeeding at, right? Not complete, because then it's too easy. It has to be a challenge. And so you look at the child and you say, well, here's your ability level. Here's one more step you could take, right? Well, then you have to do the same to yourself. You have to take stock of yourself. That's a meditational exercise. It's like, who am I? Where are my flaws? And they're not going to be something you want to face. And then you think, well, what small thing could someone as flawed as me do that I would do that would improve me? And then it's humiliating, because you think, oh my God, I really have to do something that small? That's all I'm capable of? It's like, yeah, that's your lot, man. And you better be humble enough to accept it. And then you make that small improvement, but then what you find is that small improvements, those things accumulate, those things compound, and you can start moving ahead very, very rapidly with a succession of small improvements. And there's a metaphysical element to this, but it's also the basis of behavior therapy, which is the widest employed brand of clinical psychology now in the world. Behavior therapy. It's like, well, let's figure out what your problem is. Let's figure out what your goal is. Let's break down your problem until we have a small enough piece that you can address it successfully. Let's see if you can address it successfully in the next week. You can go out and try, and if you can't, we'll cut it down a little bit more. And let's assume that incremental improvement is going to move you up. And it does. But it does require that humility. And it's not a matter of comparing yourself to other people. It's not helpful. It's like, what are you doing wrong? And you can ask yourself that, right? And the problem with asking yourself that is you get an answer. And it's not an answer you want. It's like, oh my God, really? That's what I'm doing wrong? How can I be so foolish and blind that would be my mistake? And how can I be so little and useless that this is all I can do to improve it? You got to get, that's to get down on your knees in some sense before the ideal that you're attempting to manifest, and to show where you are in relationship to that. But the upside of that is that it's an unbelievably powerful process. You can put yourself together to a staggering degree merely by ceasing doing those things you know you shouldn't do.